The morning of her wedding, Harriet Sutton ironed her own dress, not because the household staff had forgotten, and not because anyone had asked her to. She ironed it because her hands needed something to do, and standing still in that house, her father's house, with its ticking clocks and its careful silences, felt like a kind of slow suffocation. She pressed the iron along the seam of the ivory bodice and told herself that what she felt was not dread. It was simply the weight of a decision already made. She had met Gideon Parrish exactly 4 times before the wedding. The first time, he had shaken her hand and looked past her shoulder at the window. The second, he had arrived late to dinner and left early, citing a matter with his solicitor. The third, he had asked her, almost as an afterthought, whether she had any particular objections to the match. And when she said no, he had nodded once, as if confirming a figure in a ledger. The fourth was the wedding itself, and he had not looked at her once during the ceremony except when the minister required it. She told herself this was acceptable. Arranged marriages had worked for centuries. She had read enough history to know that love, when it came, arrived later, if it arrived at all. What mattered was the practical reality. Her father's business was failing. Gideon Parrish had money, connections, and a property in the Berkshires that had been in his family for 3 generations. And Harriet, 24 years old, educated, methodical, and apparently unremarkable enough that no other offer had come, was considered a reasonable exchange. She finished ironing the dress and hung it on the back of the door. Outside, a carriage waited. Parrish House sat at the end of a long gravel drive lined with oak trees that had not been trimmed in what looked like several years. The branches reached over the lane and nearly met in the middle, and in late October, the dead leaves collected along the road in drifts that no one had raked. Harriet watched the house come into view through the carriage window. Stone facade, a row of tall windows, a garden that had once been formal and was now more accurately described as ambitious in its disorder. And she felt something shift in her chest that was not quite surprise. She had imagined this place carefully during the weeks of preparation. She had imagined it maintained. The housekeeper who met her at the door was a woman named Mrs. Hollis, somewhere in her 60s, with the expression of someone who had been apologizing internally for a very long time. She curtsied and said, "Welcome, Mrs. Parrish," and the name landed strangely, like a dress that did not yet fit. "Mr. Parrish?" Harriet asked. "He has gone to Boston, ma'am. He left this morning." Mrs. Hollis paused. "He asked me to see you settled." Harriet stood in the entryway and looked at the house. The chandelier had half its candles missing. There was a smell of damp plaster from somewhere behind the walls. The floor was clean, but the baseboards were not. And through the doorway at the end of the hall, she could see a parlor with sheets over the furniture, as if the rooms were in mourning. She set down her traveling bag. She thanked Mrs. Hollis, and then she went upstairs to see what she was working with. She had been given the east bedroom, which had a view of what remained of the garden and a small writing desk beside the window. The mattress was adequate. The curtains were adequate. There was a Bible on the nightstand, and a crack in the plaster above the wardrobe, and a cold fireplace that had not been lit before her arrival. She lit it herself. Then she sat at the desk, and opened the small notebook she had brought from home, the one she had been keeping since she was 16, filled with figures and lists, and the kind of methodical observations that her mother had called excessive, and her father had called useful. She wrote the date at the top of a fresh page. She wrote, "Parrish House, arrived at 3:30. She drew a line beneath it and began to write what she had seen. The list ran to 2 pages. When Miss Hollis brought up a supper tray an hour later, she found Harriet still at the desk with ink on her fingers, and she set the tray down quietly without speaking. "How many staff remain?" Harriet asked without looking up. "4, ma'am. Myself, the cook, that's Agnes, and 2 men for the grounds. Though I should say the 2 men are doing the work of 6, and not quite managing it. I can see that." Harriet turned a page. "What about the accounts? The household accounts? Who manages them?" Mrs. Hollis went still in the way that people do when they are not sure if they are permitted to answer. "Mr. Parrish uses a firm in Boston, ma'am, Breck and Lowry. They've managed the property accounts for some years now. And the household budget? Repairs, staff wages, provisions. That comes through Breck and Lowry as well. They send an allocation each quarter, and is the allocation sufficient?" The housekeeper looked at her hands. "No, ma'am, it has not been for some time." Harriet wrote that down too. Gideon did not write for 11 days. When his letter arrived, it was brief. 3 sentences informing her that his business in Boston was taking longer than expected, that Mrs. Hollis would see to her needs, and that the East Garden had once had a greenhouse which she was welcome to use if she found it intact. The signature was formal, G. Parrish. No salutation, no inquiry after her health or comfort. Harriet read the letter twice. She placed it in the desk drawer. Then she went to find the greenhouse. It was not intact. 3 of the glass panes had been shattered by a falling branch that still lay where it had landed, and the frame had warped on one side so that the door could no longer close properly. The planting beds were barren except for weeds, and the irrigation pipes, a clever system for the era, had corroded at the joints. She stood in the middle of it, and looked up through the broken roof at the gray October sky. The next morning she asked Mrs. Hollis to find her the name of a glazier in town. It was the accounts that told her everything. She had not expected access. She had not demanded it. She had simply written a letter to Breck and Lowry in Boston, introducing herself as the new Mrs. Parrish and requesting a summary of the property accounts for her own records, mentioning in passing that she had been managing her father's household accounts since the age of 18 and preferred to be informed. The response she received was so delayed and so carefully vague that it told her more than a direct answer would have. She wrote again. This time she asked specifically, what was the management fee charged by Breck and Lowry for the administration of parish property accounts? When had this arrangement been established? Was there a contract on file, and if so, could she be sent a copy? The response to this letter did not come at all. She wrote a third time, this time to the county records office. What came back over the following 2 weeks, in pieces, through various clerks and offices, who had no particular reason to withhold anything, was a picture that made her sit very still at her writing desk for a long time. The parish property generated substantial income, timber rights on the northern acreage, lease payments from 2 tenant farms, and the proceeds from a mill on the eastern boundary that had been in continuous operation for 40 years. This income was collected by Breck and Lowry, after their management fee, which had, she discovered, been quietly increased 3 times in the past 8 years without any written authorization she could locate. A fraction of what remained was allocated to the household. The rest was held in an account that she could find no record of Gideon ever being informed about. She did not know if Gideon knew. She suspected he did not. He struck her as a man who had stopped paying attention, which was a different thing from a man who chose not to. She wrote a 4th letter. This one went to a firm in Hartford that a former schoolmate's father had once recommended, not Breck and Lowry's firm, not anyone connected to Boston society in any way she could trace. She asked for a referral to a solicitor who specialized in property accounts and estate management. Then she went back to the greenhouse and checked on the new glass panes, which the glazier had installed the previous Thursday, and she swept out the planting beds, and she began to think about what to put in the ground before the frost came. The first snow arrived in November, and with it, Gideon. He came on a Tuesday evening with no advance notice, and Harriet was in the library cataloging what remained of his family's book collection when she heard the door. She had been making her way systematically through the shelves for the past week, creating an inventory of what was there and what was not, and she had found 3 first editions under a pile of outdated newspapers that appeared to have been ignored for decades. She came into the hall to meet him. He looked tired. He looked, in the way of men who are accustomed to not being looked at carefully, surprised to be looked at carefully now. Mrs. Parrish, he said. Mr. Parrish, she said, there is a fire in the library if you would like to warm up. Agnes has kept supper. He looked past her at the hallway, and she watched him notice, without quite registering it, that the chandelier had been fitted with new candles, that the floor near the door had been relaid where the boards had been warped, that the smell of damp plaster was gone, because she had found the source, a broken gutter that had been directing water along the exterior wall, and had arranged to have it repaired. You've been busy, he said, and his voice was neutral in a way that could have meant anything. There was a good deal to be done, she said simply. They ate dinner in something approaching silence. He asked how she had found the house. She said she had found it requiring attention, and she had given it attention. He asked if she had needed anything. She said she had managed. She did not mention Breck and Lowry. She was not ready to mention Breck and Lowry. After dinner he excused himself to the study. She returned to the library and her cataloging, and they moved through the house like 2 careful strangers who had agreed to share a roof without discussing the terms. He stayed for 10 days. During those 10 days, she learned a few things about Gideon Parrish that she had not been able to learn from 4 meetings and a brief letter. He woke early, before the house stirred, and went to the study. He drank his coffee standing up. He had a habit of stopping in doorways, pausing on the threshold of rooms, as if calculating whether entry was worth the cost. He did not speak much, but when he did speak, he was precise. He said what he meant in fewer words than most men thought possible, and then he stopped. He had been married before. She had known this in the abstract. It had been mentioned at the edges of the arrangement, briefly, the way you might mention a complication that has already been resolved. His first wife had died 3 years ago. Her name had been Lena. There was a portrait of her in the upstairs hallway that someone had draped in a piece of black fabric that had been there long enough to gather dust. Harriet did not remove the fabric. That was not her place, and she knew it. But she dusted the frame. On the 8th day, she came down to the kitchen at 6 in the morning and found him already there. Standing at the window with his coffee, looking at the garden. She had been expanding the greenhouse plantings, herbs, mostly, and some early-season vegetables, in cold frames she had constructed from salvaged wood, and in the pale morning light she could see the small structures arranged along the south-facing wall. "You built those," he said, not quite a question. "With Samuel's help." Samuel was the younger of the two groundskeepers, a quiet man of about 30, who had been genuinely grateful when she asked his opinion about the soil drainage along the east wall. "He knows this property better than anyone. I've been learning from him." Gideon turned from the window. He looked at her in a way he had not looked at her before, not past her, not through her, but at her, with the specific attention of a man who has suddenly noticed something he had been failing to see. "The greenhouse," he said. "When I told you about it in the letter, I didn't think—" He stopped. "That it could be repaired? That anyone would bother?" She considered her response. "It seemed worth bothering with," she said. He looked at her for a moment longer. Then he looked back at the window. "The frost killed my mother's roses. She planted them along the south wall the year she came to this house. They were still there when I was a boy." She did not say anything immediately, because the moment seemed to ask for silence, rather than response. "I noticed the rootstock," she said after a moment. "It may still be viable. I was going to ask you before I did anything with it." He turned to look at her again. This time the look lasted longer. He left 2 days later. The solicitor from Hartford, his name was Mr. Quill, a careful man in his 50s with precise handwriting and an expression of professional calm, arrived in December to meet with her at Parish House. She had not yet told Gideon she had engaged him. She had told herself she was still gathering information. The more honest answer was that she needed to know what she was dealing with before she brought it to her husband. Because if she was wrong, she did not want to have been wrong in front of him. And if she was right, she needed to understand it well enough to explain it clearly. She spread the documents on the library table and walked Mr. Quill through what she had found. He did not say anything for a long time after she finished. Then he said, "Mrs. Parrish, how long have you been at this property?" "Since October," she said. He looked at the documents again. He looked at her. "You have been thorough," he said, in a tone that told her this was not something he said often. "I was taught to follow numbers wherever they lead," she said. "My father found it inconvenient. I have found it useful." What she had found, what Mr. Quill confirmed more formally, over the following hour, was this. Breck and Lowry had been charging a management fee that had been written nowhere in the original arrangement. They had been doing so for 8 years. They had also, she believed, been misreporting the timber income from the northern acreage, claiming losses from a lumber blight that a brief review of county agricultural records suggested had not in fact occurred. The total discrepancy, conservatively estimated, was considerable. It was the kind of sum that explained why the household accounts were perpetually short, why the repairs had never been made, why Parish House had been quietly falling into itself for nearly a decade, while Gideon Parrish, grieving and absent, had not been watching. "He didn't know," she said. "It was not a question." "From what you've shown me," Mr. Quill said carefully, "it appears that no one has shown Mr. Parrish a consolidated accounting of the property income against expenditures in some years." "They would not have wanted him to see one," she said. "No," he agreed. "They would not." She looked at the papers on the table. She thought about Gideon standing at the kitchen window looking at a garden that had been let go, saying his mother's roses had died. She thought about him in doorways, pausing, calculating whether entry was worth the cost. She thought about a man who had stopped paying attention because the grief of stopping had been less than the grief of continuing to look. "Can you take this forward?" she asked. "I can," Mr. Quill said. "It will require your husband's authorization, of course." "Of course," she said. "He will give it." She was more certain of this than of almost anything she had been certain of since October. She wrote to Gideon that evening. Not a letter about accounts or solicitors or the failures of Breck and Lowry. A letter about the house, and the garden, and the things she had been learning and doing and noticing. She told him that the cold frames were producing well despite the December weather. She told him that Samuel had identified a problem with the mill's east water wheel that had likely been reducing output for 2 years, and that she had written to a millwright in Springfield for an assessment. She told him that she had found, behind a false panel in the library, discovered when she was moving shelves to clean behind them, a collection of correspondence belonging to his grandfather, including what appeared to be the original survey maps of the property. At the end of the letter, she mentioned briefly that she had engaged a solicitor to review certain aspects of the property accounts, and that if he had time she would appreciate the opportunity to show him what she had found. She did not tell him what she had found. She trusted that he would come. He arrived 9 days later. She showed him the documents in the library, at the same table where she had shown Mr. Quill, with a fire going and the survey maps spread beside the accounts for reference. She walked him through it the same way she had walked Mr. Quill through it, methodically, in order, with the figures where she could show them and the gaps where she could point them out. He did not say anything while she talked. He stood at the table and looked at the documents, and she watched his face move through something she did not have a name for yet. Not anger, not grief, though both were there somewhere underneath. Something more like the expression of a man who has been living in a room with bad air for so long that he had stopped noticing it, and someone has finally opened a window. When she finished, there was a silence. "How long?" he said. His voice was level in the controlled way of some keeping it level deliberately. "The management fee appears to begin 8 years ago," she said. "The income misreporting is harder to date precisely, at least 5 years, based on the agricultural records." He was quiet again. "I wanted to understand it completely before I brought it to you," she said. "I didn't want to bring you a suspicion. I wanted to bring you facts." He looked up from the documents. He looked at her. And this look was different from all the other looks, different from the dinner table, and the kitchen window and the doorways. This look had something in it she had not seen from him before, a kind of careful attention that felt, for the first time, mutual. "You did this in 6 weeks," he said. 8 weeks, she corrected. He almost smiled. It was small and quickly controlled, but it was there. 8 weeks, he said. She met his eyes. "Mr. Parrish, what would you like to do?" What he would like to do, it emerged over the following weeks, was considerably more than she had anticipated. He engaged Mr. Quill's firm formally. He traveled to Boston to confront Breck and Lowry directly. She did not go with him, but she prepared the documents he brought, organized and annotated in a manner that Mr. Quill later said was the clearest presentation of financial evidence he had seen from a layperson. Breck and Lowry's senior partner, a man named Alderman, attempted first to dismiss the concerns, and then, when it became clear dismissal was not available to him, attempted to characterize the discrepancies as misunderstandings. Gideon was not interested in misunderstandings. There were legal proceedings. There was a settlement. There were new arrangements with a different firm, one that Harriet had identified from her correspondence with Mr. Quill, and vetted with a thoroughness that the new firm found, their representative admitted, somewhat unusual in a client's wife. Gideon was in Boston for much of this period, and then in Hartford, and then in Boston again. He wrote to her regularly now, not long letters, because brevity was the shape of his communication, but regular ones, and they asked questions. About the mill assessment, about the cold frames, about whether Samuel had spoken with the millwright yet, about what she thought should be done with the northern acreage once the timber rights were properly accounted for. She answered every question. She asked her own. Somewhere in December, without either of them saying so, they had begun to talk. He came home in January with snow on his coat and a look on his face that she could not quite read, and she met him in the hall, and took his coat, and told him there was lamb stew in the kitchen because the temperature had dropped to 10 degrees and she had decided that was lamb stew weather. He looked at her. "You decided," he said. "I did," she said. "I find that when I decide things, they tend to get done." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I'm aware of that." They sat in the kitchen because the dining room was formal and the kitchen was warm, and Harriet had stopped apologizing for preferring warmth. She told him about the mill wheel, which the millwright had now repaired, and about the North Field, where she had been in correspondence with an agrarian society in Boston, about the soil composition and what it might support. He told her about the settlement, which had gone in their favor, and about the new account arrangements, and about the meeting with Alderman, which he described in 3 sentences that managed to convey a great deal. She watched him talk. She watched him sit at a kitchen table eating lamb stew with the ease of a man who had not sat easily anywhere in some time. She noticed. She was always noticing that he had lost some of the careful distance he had carried in October. He still paused in doorways sometimes, but he was crossing them now. "The roses," he said, when they had been sitting quietly for a moment. "You mentioned the rootstock might be viable." "I believe it is," she said. "I spoke with a nurseryman in Lenox. He thinks if we protect the roots through winter they'll come back in spring. They'll need attention, but they're there." He looked at the table. "My mother planted those the year she came here," he said. "She told me once that she had been frightened when she arrived. She said the house seemed very large and very cold, and she didn't know anyone, and she felt like a guest who wasn't sure how long she was allowed to stay." Harriet did not speak. "She said the garden was how she learned to stay," he said. "She started with the roses, because they needed the most attention, and she found that anything that needed her attention was easier to love than anything that didn't." Harriet looked at him across the table. He was not looking at her. He was looking at the window, at the dark outside, at some point past the glass that she could not see. "I think I understand that," she said quietly. He looked at her then, directly, fully, in the way she had been learning to recognize as his particular version of attention. Not casual, not passing, but deliberate and present, and costly enough that he gave it carefully. "Yes," he said, "I believe you do." Spring came slowly to the Berkshires. The roses came back, as the nurseryman had promised they would. Not all of them, but enough. Green pushing through the mulch in March and the first buds forming in April. Harriet was in the garden with Samuel when she saw the first one open, a pale pink that she had not known to expect, and she felt something in her chest that she had stopped knowing how to name. She had a habit now of walking the property in the mornings, going through the same loop she had walked in October when she was taking stock of everything that needed doing, except that the list had changed so much that it was almost unrecognizable. The mill wheel ran smoothly. The greenhouse was producing through the winter and had been expanded. The north acreage had a plan. The household accounts were funded properly, for the first time in 8 years, and Mrs. Hollis had hired 2 additional staff, a younger woman for the house and a man for the gardens, and she had lost the apologetic quality in her expression, or at least she had lost it when Harriet was nearby. Gideon had been home more than away since January. He did not say why, or perhaps the why was simply that the work of the settlement had concluded, and there was no particular reason to be in Boston. He was in his study most mornings, managing the correspondence she had helped him reorganize. He came to meals. He had begun to appear, on certain evenings, in the library, sitting in the chair by the window with a book or a document while she sat at the desk and worked on her own correspondence. They did not talk constantly in these evenings. They did not need to, but they talked, and the talking had become, without announcement, without ceremony, one of the things she looked forward to. She did not examine this too closely. She was not sure she was ready to examine it. The letter from her father arrived in April. He wrote to inquire how she was getting on, which was his way of inquiring whether the arrangement had proved viable, which was his way of asking whether he would be called upon to manage any inconvenient complications. She wrote back truthfully. She was well. The house was considerably improved. Mr. Parrish was managing the property accounts with more direct involvement now. She had taken an interest in the grounds and found it suiting her. She reread what she had written before sealing it. She had not told him about Brecon Lowry, or the months of correspondence with Mr. Quill, or the long evenings in the library. She had not told him about the roses or the greenhouse, or the mill, or the survey maps found behind a false panel. She had not told him that she had learned to read a man who communicated in brevity and doorway pauses, and that she had found, in the reading of him, something she had not been looking for. She sealed the letter. She went downstairs, and Gideon was in the kitchen again. He had acquired the habit, she had noticed, of being in whatever room she was likely to come through next. And he was looking at something on the table, a set of drawings she had made with the millwright for the northern acreage's drainage plan. He looked up when she came in. He said, "The drainage on the eastern boundary. You've marked it wrong here." She crossed to the table and looked. "I haven't marked it wrong. The fall is in that direction. The fall is in that direction, according to Samuel, who learned the property from his father, who came here in 1861, and who may have been working from the original drainage that has since shifted." She looked at the drawing. She looked at him. "You think the land has changed. I think the mill flooding that's been reported in spring for the past 15 years suggests the water is going somewhere the drainage didn't account for." He picked up the pencil from the table, her pencil, from her drawing, and made a mark, here. She looked at the mark. She looked at him. He was looking at the drawing with the concentrated attention of a man who knows a piece of land the way you know the face of someone you grew up with. "You know this property," she said. "I grew up here," he said. He stopped. He set down the pencil. "I stopped paying attention." The words fell into the kitchen and sat there. "You were paying attention to other things," she said carefully. He was quiet for a moment. "I was not paying attention to anything useful," he said. "I was very thorough about it." She did not say anything, because what she wanted to say was too many things at once, and she was not yet in the habit of saying too many things at once. "Harriet," he said. He almost never used her given name. She had noticed this. She had been noticing it. "Yes," she said. He looked at the drawing. He looked at the pencil mark he had made. He said, with the precision of a man who chooses words because the wrong ones are too costly, "I owe you more than I have said." The kitchen was quiet. Outside through the window, the garden held the pale green of early spring, and somewhere along the south wall the roses were opening. "You don't owe me," she said. "I didn't do it for accounts. I did it because it needed doing, and because—" She stopped. He looked at her. "Because this is my home," she said. "It became my home somewhere in October, and I decided that meant something." He held her gaze for a long moment, held it in the way he held things carefully, deliberately, because they mattered to him. "Yes," he said quietly, "it does." He did not say more than that. He didn't need to. She had learned by now to read what Gideon Parrish left in his silences, and what he left in them now was something she had not seen there in October. The careful, considered, unguarded beginning of a man coming back to himself. Outside, the roses continued to open. The mill wheel turned. The accounts balanced, and in the kitchen of Parrish House, on a morning in April that smelled like cold earth and new growth, and lamb stew from the night before, Harriet Parrish reached out and moved the pencil mark to where she believed it should be, and her husband, watching her, let himself smile.